edition of Dr. Will's History Road Trip, I traveled to Vicksburg, Mississippi to go to the National Battlefield Park there and talk about the Battle of Vicksburg with a good friend of mine and distinguished Civil War scholar, Dr. Andrew Lang of Mississippi State University. Dr. Lang is the author of such distinguished books as In the Wake of War, Military Occupation, Emancipation, and Civil War America. He has a new book coming out early 2021. Hope you enjoy part one of my discussion with Dr. Andrew Lang. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Dr. Will's History Road Trip. I'm here in Vicksburg, Mississippi today, and I'm joined by distinguished Civil War scholar, Mississippi State professor, Dr. Andrew F. Lang, affectionately known to me as Andy since we went to grad school together. Good to see you, Andy.
Good to see you too.
And so what we're going to do is we're going to cover, and we may break this into two parts, but we're going to cover the Vicksburg campaign and why this campaign is important. And we started filming here because if you look behind us, you can see that we're really high up on a bluff, and there are bluffs all along this section of the Mississippi River. And you can see, well, you can't really see the main river channel in the background. This is a canal, but you can understand why Vicksburg would have been important to the Confederacy to defend. So why don't we start there, Andy? What makes Vicksburg such a key location? Because even Abraham Lincoln at one point said Vicksburg is the key.
That's right. I actually have the quote here. He said, "See what a lot of land these fellows hold, of which Vicksburg is the key. Let us get Vicksburg, and all that country is ours. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket." So why is Vicksburg the key according to Lincoln? And according to Jefferson Davis, what he called Vicksburg was the nailhead that holds the two halves of the Confederacy together. And so right there we can envision a map of the Southern Confederacy, of which Vicksburg is almost in the center, holding the Trans-Mississippi to the Cis-Mississippi, the eastern and western parts of the Confederacy together. The reason it's so important is because it was traditionally, long before the American Civil War, a commercial center, a depot, a rail depot, and obviously a water center on the Mississippi River that shipped all kinds of agricultural goods from Minnesota all the way down to the most important port in the United States, New Orleans. When the Civil War started, the idea was that whoever controlled the Mississippi River would control the fate of the conflict itself. I have a few minor qualms about that we can talk about later, but it is nevertheless important. The Mississippi River, Vicksburg in particular, informed much of the Union's early strategic vision, in which Winfield Scott, the General-in-Chief of the United States Army, developed what he called, or what was popularly known as the Anaconda Plan, in which Union naval forces would control the Mississippi River, blockade the Gulf and Atlantic coasts, and send invading armies into the interior of the Confederacy in hopes ultimately to strangle the Confederacy politically and economically. And so that's how we get to Vicksburg in late 1862 and 1863 as part of that original strategic vision outlined by Scott and President Lincoln in 1861. Now, if the Anaconda Plan is developed in May of 1861, but Vicksburg doesn't fall until, of course, July 4th, 1863, why did it take so long? Well, this is why we're starting our tour here today, overlooking the river. We can see just how naturally fortified this position was. The Confederacy not only had more than 100 large guns overlooking the Mississippi River, but Vicksburg itself offered natural defenses, as you can see. Vicksburg was the last, second to last, technically speaking, major stronghold on the Mississippi River to fall, July 4th, 1863, followed by Port Hudson, Louisiana, some 200 miles to the south of us, on July 9th, 1863. But Vicksburg is by far the most important. Whoever controlled Vicksburg would control the entire Mississippi River, and that was the Union's goal from the beginning of the war until now. The reason it took so long is because of these natural defenses, as we said. But the main military reason why Vicksburg did ultimately fall was because the generalship of Ulysses S. Grant, the United States Army commander in charge of this operation.
So what What is it about Ulysses S. Grant that makes him so successful in this operation? Because Grant, even today, has his detractors. People, sometimes he's referred to as a butcher. The only reason he wins battles is because he overwhelms with numbers, things like that. I disagree with that, and I think you do too.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so, by the time the Vicksburg campaign starts, Grant has already emerged as one of the premier, if not the premier, military hero in the United States. Most soldiers in the Eastern Theater would have heralded George B. McClellan as their military champion, but Grant had results under his belt by the time the campaign began in earnest in December 1862. Grant begins the Vicksburg campaign already on the heels of two significant victories. His captures of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in February of 1862, which opens the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers as highways of invasion from Tennessee and ultimately into the Deep South. And then in April 1862, Grant was victorious at the Battle of Shiloh, which sealed his reputation as somebody, as Lincoln said, I cannot spare this man, he fights. But as you said, Will, it's much more complex than that. Yes, Grant's a fighter, but he also has a strategic vision and a patience about him that serves him well in all campaigns in which he is engaged. And Vicksburg is, I think, the best example of Grant's military acumen on display. Why? Well, if the campaign lasts from December of 1862 to July of 1863, that suggests a long time. It's almost 8 months. And in that 8 months, Grant confronts failure far more than he does success in his attempt to get at this city. It's Grant's patience, it's his ability to change his approach to fighting. It's Grant's ability not to be beholden to military theory, but instead to look at a circumstance before him and adapt. And that's what he does all throughout this campaign. What makes this campaign difficult are the natural obstacles before him. Grant first tries to approach Vicksburg from the north. Grant's campaign against Vicksburg actually happens in the northern part of the state, in what's called Grant's Central Mississippi Campaign, in which he tries to get to Vicksburg from the north, but he faces several obstacles. One, unusual rainstorms in the winter of 1862 and early 1863 that just turns all the roads into impassable mush. He also faces I don't know how many hundreds of square miles of swampland in northwestern Mississippi in the Delta that he has to navigate and ultimately can't navigate. He also faces military obstacles. Confederate cavalry under Nathan Bedford Forrest and General Earl Van Dorn impose all kinds of harassment to Grant's supply lines. Earl Van Dorn even destroys a major Union depot at Holly Springs, Mississippi, December 20th, 1862. The ultimate point is, by the late winter 1863, beginning of spring 1863, Grant's 4 months into his campaign and has yet to find any natural route to Vicksburg. He even tries to dig canals to cut through the Mississippi River, which you did yesterday. But what Grant ultimately realizes is that he has to come up with a way to get to Vicksburg that is somewhat unconventional. It can't just be a simple overland route to the city. So what does he do? Well, he employs what he already had employed in the Henry and Donelson campaign, a combined operation with the United States Navy, which in this time, it actually speaks to Grant's humility. Grant is a general of an entire army, the Army of the Tennessee, and back then, who's gonna enjoy the laurels of victory? Well, I mean, it has to be the Army, right? Or it has to be the Navy. Well, Grant understands that it has to be both.
Right.
And so what he ultimately does, he realizes that he has to get his soldiers onto dry ground, high ground, in order to have some kind of an effective march onto the city. And so all of his soldiers are on the west bank of the Mississippi River on the Louisiana side in the spring of 1863. He marches them all the way down past Vicksburg, some 40 or 50 miles below the city, and has the United States Navy under the command of Admiral David Dixon Porter, who has 8 transport boats and 3 gunboats, or it may be reversed. I can't remember. But all of those boats run the gauntlet right here past the Vicksburg batteries. Only one is sunk. All those boats, at least those remaining, end up 50 miles below the city, which Grant uses to ferry all of his troops across the river and then march inland into Mississippi. Which then raises the next question. Well, Grant surely then marched due north to capture the city, correct? Of course not. Because Grant adapts. He sees 3, 4, 5 steps in front of him. And what he ultimately realizes needs to happen is he needs to neutralize all Confederate forces in the entire region. And before him, he actually has two Confederate armies facing him. An army defending the city under the command of John Pemberton, the Confederate general who has some 30,000 soldiers defending the city. But Grant also faces a Confederate army under the command of General Joseph Johnston, who also has some 31,000 soldiers in central Mississippi, about 35 miles east of here at Jackson. Grant himself he'll ultimately have 70,000 soldiers under command, at least when the siege begins. But Grant's first objective is not Vicksburg. It's actually Jackson and Joseph Johnston's army. And what he does is he marches from his base at Bruinsburg down 50 miles below here. He marches northeast to Jackson, neutralizes Johnston's army at Jackson, and then marches due west, really following the route of today's Interstate 20, where he then confronts Pemberton's army. Along the way from his starting point at the Mississippi River until he gets to the gates of Vicksburg, Grant fights 5 battles at Raymond, Jackson, Champions Hill, the Big Black River. I'm missing one.
Port Gibson.
Thank you.
Port Gibson's the first one.
Yes, absolutely right. I knew.
I just know that because I was there yesterday.
That's right. and he wins them all. And then he gets to the gates of Vicksburg, where he believes that one major frontal assault will ultimately break the Confederate line. On May 19th, 1863, he authorizes a full frontal offensive against the Confederates' defensive entrenchments, and he's repulsed.
Bloodily.
Absolutely. But yet he does it again 3 days later on May 22nd, 1863, and again is repulsed bloodily. Now, the nature of your question was, Grant has a reputation of being a mindless, heartless butcher, and that's entirely incorrect, I think. Grant had superior numbers. He had superior soldiers, I think. He had superior subordinate officers. So why didn't he just keep throwing them against this gauntlet? Well, it's because he was not a butcher. Think of it this way. This campaign started in December 62, ended in July 1863, and Grant suffered only 10,000 casualties during the entire 7 to 8 month campaign. That is hardly the product of a butcher. The irony of this is Grant actually could have kept hurling his soldiers against the Confederate defenses, and his soldiers' morale actually would have sustained itself because it was an offensive action. Grant actually faced a much more dangerous situation, I think, by opting to besiege Vicksburg, because in a siege, especially in the summer months down here in the deep South, you're going to run the risk of rampant disease, which he did. You're going to run the risk of soldiers' morale collapsing, which it nearly did, but it didn't. I think the point is that Grant understands. He had humility to understand the task before him, the limits before him, and he had a choice: how best to use his soldiers. He opted for a siege, and it ultimately worked.
Okay. We talked about Grant now. I want to talk about the 2 Confederate commanders, Johnston and Pemberton, because just as I think Grant in his campaign is impressive, I think Pemberton and Johnston are equally unimpressive. And you made a statement a minute ago, and I agree with it, that Grant had better equipment, he had better subordinate officers, he had better soldiers. And I think part of the reason his soldiers' morale is high is not so much that they're good fighting men in the Confederate Army in Mississippi, but they've been led by incompetence for so long, and morale is down.
That's right.
You get to the Big Black River Bridge, which we referenced, and a whole wing of the army just takes off running.
That's right. Yeah, I'm glad that you modified my statement. I don't mean to suggest that,
Right.
that there was something superior about Union soldiers. At the end of the day, these are all citizen soldiers. They're all volunteers on both
All
sides.
Americans.
Absolutely. They're all trained in pretty much the same way. They're all derived from the same kind of culture. But I think what made Union soldiers superior in this campaign was simply because they were led by different people.
Yes.
And if you think about it, I'll get to Pemberton and Johnston in a minute, but you think about what Union soldiers' principal task was during this campaign. It was not fighting. Yes, Grant fought 5 battles, but that happens toward the end of the entire campaign. The majority of the Vicksburg campaign, from December to July, was digging trenches in mud, trying to reroute the Mississippi River, trying to dig canals across the river. In other words, Union soldiers were used largely as laborers, and it was hard, back-breaking, impossible labor. But one reason Grant had them doing all that was to keep them moving, to keep them from sitting idle, because that would have collapsed morale. That would have shown Union soldiers, and especially the Northern home front, we're not doing anything. We're not making any headway in this campaign. We're just sitting. And we're sitting at the exact same time that the United States had been sitting, if you will, under George B. McClellan for pockets of 1862. I mean, if you think about it, McClellan didn't campaign against Richmond, Virginia until the spring, until April of 1862, after being idle for 6 to 8 months. Grant understood that idleness is going to be psychological death to his soldiers and to the home front. And so that's why he kept his soldiers busy. On the flip side, the Confederacy, I think, was really hampered by their 2 commanders in this theater, Pemberton and Johnston. And we can talk a bit about the problems that they faced in their defense. I think that part of their problems were not exclusive to them. Part of their problems was that there were conflicts in command. I think there were conflicts in the instructions and the orders given to each of them. On the one hand, John C. Pemberton had been given control of what was called the Department of Mississippi and East Louisiana in late 1862, and he reported directly to the president, to President Jefferson Davis, who ordered Pemberton hold Vicksburg at all costs. That was his principal military duty.
So right there, he's committed to basically a static defense.
That's right, and to an extent, he did exactly what he was supposed to do. I mean, he turned Vicksburg into an amazing fortress. Jefferson Davis even visited the defenses of Vicksburg in late 1862, and he signed off on what Pemberton had constructed. He said, "This is an impenetrable fortress. This city will not fall." The problem with this is that accompanying Davis and Pemberton that day, when Davis inspected the defenses, was Joseph Johnston, who, I mean, Davis could say the sky is blue, and Johnston would say, no, it's orange. And so that's part of the problem.
Yeah.
Johnston looked at the defense and said, no, this is not going to work. And the reason it's not going to work, it's not because it was weak defenses, but because, as you said earlier, there's nowhere else to go. One of the natural obstacles to Vicksburg is this right here. There's nowhere to move west of the city. In the event that Pemberton's forces were somehow pinned within Vicksburg, that's how they would meet their fate. That's what Johnston said. And he was right about that. Well, so what is Johnston's role? Well, Johnston's role is to be the principal military commander of this broader region. And so he has control over the armies. And so after Grant moves from the river inland toward Jackson, and then ultimately from Jackson to Vicksburg, Johnston repeatedly sends orders to Pemberton, move out of the city, get your army north and east of the city, perhaps we can meet up and combine our forces. Pemberton doesn't do it. He never does it because, again, his role, his order, is to defend the city at all costs. Now, this is where we run into problems with Joseph Johnston. Johnston never leaves Jackson, and that's a problem. Johnston could have harassed Grant on his march to Vicksburg. He could have harassed Grant during the siege itself, and he never does. He remains largely in and around the Jackson area. And so we have conflicts in command, we have divided command, and this is kind of indicative of the entire Confederate command structure for the entire Civil War. To put it simply, there is no Robert E. Lee in the Western Theater.
Right.
And had there been, things may well have been different, but there wasn't.
And the one battle the Confederates do win in the West is because Lee's first corps under Longstreet's
That's right.
there.
That's right. That's exactly
At
right.
Chickamauga.
Of course. Yep.
Excellent. So Pemberton is pretty much, he's not a great commander anyway, but he does the job he's assigned to do. The problem is the strategy and the command structure right
That's
from
right.
the very beginning.
I think that's right.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go and look at some different parts of the battlefield.
Great.
We'll kind of demonstrate why Vicksburg was such a tough nut.
I hope you enjoyed this edition of Dr. Will's History Road Trip. If you like what I'm doing and want to continue following, please subscribe to my channel and click the notification button so you'll get updates when I post new content. Also, please consider supporting me via PayPal, Venmo, or CashApp. Your support will enable me to go to interesting places and film them and talk about them with you. Feel free to suggest locations that you might like to see me visit in the comments below. Thank you very much, and I'll see you on the road.